Um, Thank you for the introduction. I have been in and out of the world of recovery since 1998. So I've seen, observed, cared for at some points hundreds, if not thousands, of people that have been in and out of the throes of substance use disorder. At present, for the last 5 years, we've had a small residential and ambulatory care center here in New Brunswick, Canada, that is completely based upon the behavioral neuroscience of addiction. And so I work with a couple very active minds, and we apply this approach. And currently, we've had a consistent 83% success rate at 1 year. We find that the more that people actually understand about what's really going on from an organic sense, the better. And so this piece, I'll just move forward. Um, I'm just trying to see it. I'm sorry how to flip. Uh, Maybe you could help me out, Doctor. I'm screen
Is this
sharing.
a PDF?
No,
Oh, are you able to scroll it to the next slide?
I'm going to try. Okay. So we look after severe substance use disorder. That is, on the DSM scale, we are, for the most part, 11s, if not 12. And so a lot of our material comes from some people that have been to some terrible places in their world of addiction and sometimes into recovery. And really, what we're talking about is trying to find a rational answer for incredibly, extraordinarily irrational behavior that violates people's personal morality sets. What drives this madness? Um, as an example, when I was working emergency room, in a small town where I was working up north. Uh, Monday was a holiday and the liquor stores were closed. Now, this small town had his liquor store was in a trailer, um, and people ran out. So someone actually hooked up the trailer to their truck and stole the entire liquor store and drove it off into the woods. It's just bizarre story to stories that I hear much too often of the lengths to which people go uh, to get substances, is filled in a world of emotional, physical, sexual trauma, high mortality rates, and incredible morbidity that just seems to prolong and deepen the disorder itself, making getting out of it even more difficult. Um, we tend to work with people who are well employed, that have become addicted, um, and their desire is to continue to function, and more than anything in the world, and they're using substances to get to it on a daily basis, is to feel normal enough to be able to put in a day at work, go to meetings, what have you, because there's something going on that is absolutely debilitating, whereby the shakes, the madness, the catastrophizing, the often incredible anxiety, the complete lack of energy, that substances are now fueling what is perceived by the addicted person as normal. And so, that being said, the notion was, as an engineering physics from my background, that there had to be something in the brain, in the limbic system specifically, that acted as an amplifier, as a signal amplifier, um, which created such a signal energy, a strength, that it was essentially overpowering all rationale about it. And people who are in the field are fairly familiar with this. And sometimes it takes very little, and other times it takes a fair bit of stressors for this to kick in. And so, as an example, the best analogy, and it's actually a really good one, that's held true now for 7 years since we started working on this specific aspect of it, acts as a transistor amplifier. A transistor is a semiconductor that transmits varying degrees of electrical current power, based on what the semiconductor components are, what it's actually made of in terms of conductive and non-conductive material, the mix, as well as the inputs into it, whereby it can actually work as diminishing signal, or on the other hand, increasing signal. And just as an example from the 70s, turning up the dial on a stereo typically used transistors to amplify up the signal. And so we thought there's something going on that is just creating so much drive to take people to these terrible places, that it's got to be something more than lack of reward. It has to be. And so, in the beginning, in terms of exploring this model and comparing to behavior, the current thinking about this, it's seen sporadically in the literature, whereas in my opinion, for the most part, the discussions are on the reward aspect of it, of addiction, the reward seeking, the reward lack, but not actually what I'm going to be speaking of today, which is actually the overpower of negative valency through the anti-reward system. And nonetheless, what is currently referred to as the dark side of addiction, first coined by Dr. Koob, who I believe is still the the head of NIDA in the early 2000s, he came up with this really important concept, which still stands to today, called the dark side of addiction, which he's really referring to things as withdrawal, acute withdrawal, and thereafter, um, and a functionally low dopamine state due essentially to a couple key areas of the limbic system, one being the mesolimbic pathway from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens, the classic in addiction anyways, dopamine circuitry has become blunted over time because of substance use. And at the same time, the amygdala, which is neurotypically is there for survival, as are all aspects of the limbic system, to signal appropriate fear, appropriate anger, appropriate aggression, in men, appropriate sexual response, so that the person reacts normally. Now, substance use disorder, the amygdala hypertrophies tremendously, often quadruples in size, which size is one thing, but it's also corresponding to its output signal, that becomes much more amplified. So that part of the brain is very hyper excitable, and creates hyper a whole lot of hypertrophic output. And so that is one synapse away from the hypothalamus, which then essentially I consider it, for simplicity's sake, key link between brain body, in that hypothalamus, as one of its functions, activates the sympathetic nervous system and stress response, and that then gives all the bodily symptoms associated with stress, which can be then interpreted back as chronic irritability, physical pain, emotional pain. People will complain of psychic pain, which I think is a really good description, malaise, dysphoria, alexithymia, these more mesolimbic pathway related, but those essential four structures are thought to be the main contributors to what Dr. Coop turns the dark side of addiction. And certainly take away the chemicals from someone who is addicted, and the midbrain essentially goes into its own shocky state, meaning what's happening, because in the clients that we see, stage 12 substance use disorders, the midbrain has now interpreted that drugs and alcohol are good for survival, and now taking it away, the midbrain now feels threat, in turn responds by activating stress response system, which gives a general dysphoria, coincident with prefrontal cortex that is not functioning properly, meaning in particular inability to suppress those terrible feelings uh, resulting from neurobiology, the conscious knowledge of where the person is in the now, um, simply completely overpowered. And on that basis, the dark side then, in lack of alternative, the lack ability to modulate this, uh, the natural result is substances. And so, in short, very short, that is thought to be the dark side of addiction, which is a huge impediment to achieving sustained recovery. Sustained recovery, in our minds and our perspective, is adequate, positive, healthy neuroadaptation that's starting to approach neurotypicality, such that the emotional centers, hypothalamus, amygdala, reward centers are starting to damp down. Prefrontal cortex is now starting to repower up so that the person's choice is restored. They're not powerless over substances anymore. And typically that's very much coincident with life events and environment getting back on track because of healthy decision making that's now becoming reestablished. Now, it's mentioned in some of the later literature about the uh, recruitment of the habenula. And in our opinion, and this is, our work is based on matching behavior that we see day in, day out with uh, education and very heavy research into the journal world to try and make sense of what's going on. And it's generally, we can see a really tight fit, and particularly a tight fit with what I'm presenting today, which is a minimum for severe substance use disorder. We think more of a driving force than is the typical dopamine deficiency reward hypothesis. We feel that the hypodopaminergic state is actually underestimated in terms of its power as well as stress. And we believe that the conceptual framework that we speak of now is one that's anatomically very close to the reward system. Actually is situated essentially right within the ventral tegmental area, particularly a piece called the rostromedial tegmentum, which is one synapse away from the lateral habenula. And that circuitry, the circuitry within the lateral habenula, we feel is a super critical piece to understanding what we term as anti-reward system, and major driver to reinstatement of drug seeking and alcohol seeking and consumption. And so the lateral habenula, and I want to say this is all as well in the context of understanding stress, which I think that the literature has a really good handle on in terms of uh, stress, chronic stress hormones, and epinephrine, cortisol, and CRF. Their activity really stalls, if not worsens, um, recovery of the neural networks and structures within substance use disorder. We know that CRF and cortisol, essentially in persons with substance use disorder, act almost exactly in the same manner as the substances themselves in terms of causing hypertrophy of amygdala, chronic high set point of the hypothalamus, and hypofunctioning of particularly the orbitofrontal cortex. And so I'm speaking within this same context. This is all activating at the same time. However, the extra push over the top that we believe is the major driver to push people over the edge into doing incredibly regretful things, sometimes dying in pursuit of. And we believe that there's really good evidence that the habenula itself plays a critical role. So again, just to return, I briefly have tried to outline the current dark side of addiction. We feel it's an incomplete match with behavior. There's more going on. And so when we started examining Pavlovian learning and reward prediction error, and again, following a notion that, well, yes, with reward, there is a positive dopamine signal, that omission of reward actually gives a relative negative spike in dopamine. And we feel that that was sort of our first hint into the neurobiology of the anti-reward, was that negative spike in dopamine. And neurotypically, we learn as mammals what to avoid. And I give the example of going to the fridge, opening up a pot of something that's turned absolutely foul because it's been in there for weeks and everyone's forgotten about it. The immediate scent of it gives a huge impulse to throw it out. Not a, let's think about it, maybe I should do this, maybe that. No, it's instantaneous. And of course, the olfactory signals one synapse away from the midbrain, so it's instant, immediately fires off, immediately this strong avoidance, involuntary comes in, and that's where this overamplification of negative stimuli, we believe that that's a neurotypical role of the lateral habenula to make certain that one does not touch that hot stove again. And so bringing it into severe substance use disorder, whereby the midbrain has been hijacked to understand that drugs and alcohol are actually key to survival. Now, take those away, that mounts a huge threat to survival of species, which, of course, even though it's like most things in addiction, it's flipped upside down, the habenula then reacts that this is a very bad thing to do. And so the more times that the cycle of stopping happens and habenula activates, its neuroadaptations are such that it becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. And typically people with we'll speak to with advanced alcohol, with advanced opiates, or it's much clearer to see it in, even though it's within all addictive substances, where people are consuming in anticipation of potential withdrawal. And they're drinking or using substances to avoid that horrible withdrawal, which believe is in large part mediated by magnification of that negative dopamine spike by the lateral habenula. And there does seem to be very good evidence that the lateral habenula does actually amplify the signal back to the rostromedial tegmentum, driving the motivational circuits of the mesolimbic system. And so substances, of course, will then turn that off. Need has been fulfilled in a deadly way. The habenula has done its work. And the disease progresses. The disorder continues to progress and progress and progress. We're short on time. I want to be able to take a few questions. So, what's the point of all of this? From a clinical setting, the adult experience of trauma in substance use disorder is associated with incredible amounts of shame and guilt, to the point that people feel they just can never, ever, 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 ever forgive themselves and put it behind. Now, describing the neurobiology of this actually happening, that yes, you were powerless, and part of that powerlessness is this anti-reward system that is driving you beyond choice, beyond any set of standards you want set for yourself. They're just neurobiologically out the door. And so how could I have ever done that? The answer is, this is how it happened. This is what the disorder does. Also, something to be very wary of in the first 2 to 3 months of recovery, that it seems that the anti-reward system is fairly slow to recover. And so drawing this further, because it amplifies negative dopaminergic states, then it tends there's a propensity, although I've not read anything on this, of it, or I haven't read substantially on this, that the anti-reward system actually magnifies the level of negative valence states, meaning anger's worse. We already know it's worse because of hyperactivity of the amygdala. We know that. But this is an additional, this is the beyond what the dark side would show. And so in terms of understanding the neurobiology, it allows us to understand and reassure people along a certain time frame that recovery from this aspect of it is fully possible as well. And so that's it. 2 minutes of questions or more. I've got lots of time.